Good evening, everyone. Thank you guys for coming out tonight to be a part of this important conversation about ethylene oxide and its impact to our community. Before we begin, I would like to give thanks to our special guest that came from out of town to help us understand this topic. First, we got Marvin C. Brown, senior attorney from Earth Justice. Where's he at? Oh, there he is. Next, we got Dr. Richard Peltier from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Also joining us, she's a lady on the screen, Dr. Kimberly Terrell from New Orleans, Tulane Environmental Law Clinic. And last but not least, we got air scientist Michelle Mapson. She's right there. She's from Earth Justice. Next, I want to give thanks to our distinguished guests that are here joining us tonight. I want to give a special thanks to Mayor of Laredo, Dr. Victor Trevino. Next, we have Ms. Melissa Cigarroa, District 3. Next, we have Ms. Vanessa Perez, District 7. Sorry about that. Then we got Ms. Alisa Cigarroa, District 8. And we also have with us Dr. Chamberlain, Public Health Director for Laredo. Last but not least, I also want to give thanks to our risk board members. I know I saw Victor Vasquez. He is the chair of City Park Committee. Also, I heard Juan Livas is here. Thank you to Juan Livas. Sydney and Margarita as well. Thank you guys for joining us. So let's get started. We are honored to have Mayor Dr. Victor D. Trevino with us. Please join me in welcoming him for a few words.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Dr. Victor Trevino, Mayor for the City of Laredo. I'm pleased to be here today and welcome everyone to the City of Laredo for the Clean Air Coalition Ethylene Oxide Community Town Hall meeting at our Joe Guerra Library. As the leader of our local government, this has been a very important topic for our community. And it is one that our community has been engaged since the initial reporting came out that we had one of the largest emitters of this dangerous emission in the country, located in our community. I was a health authority at that time, and there was some support, especially by our councilwoman from District 7, Vanessa Perez, who's here to join us. But it wasn't enough to convince the city council at that time to fully fund a program such as the one we have now. Now, under my administration, with the co-sponsorship of Councilman Perez, the City Council funded an air quality program within the Health Department with over $400,000 to start this first-of-a-kind program, and will monitor other emissions, like ethylene oxide also, as part of the core function of this local government. We also have established a binational, thank you. We also have established a binational environmental public health summit that is supported also by my Mexican counterparts, Alcaldesa Carmen Cantu Rosas, Mayor of Nuevo Laredo. I will serve as a component in addition to the annual binational public health conferences that were established for the first time last year as an agreement between myself and the Governor of Tamaulipas, Dr. Americo Villarreal. I do want to thank all for the hard work and grassroots organizations like the Clean Air Coalition, which has contributed a meaningful engagement with industry and regulatory agencies. I have personally taken a tour of the sanitation plant, sterilization plant myself in our community and have seen additional installation of equipment in their plant and have discussed some of the findings and concerns raised by the community. Unfortunately, as of today, there has not been any movement or commitment to a relocation. With that being known, as mayor, I believe that it is essential and a core function of the local government to continue its commitment to the surveillance of this emission through the health department and the findings be available to the public. Just as an update, with TCEQ leadership, there has been some surveillance conducted recently, and the results will be released in the next 60 days. Now, I see that Councilwoman Vanessa is here also. I don't know if she wants to say some comments also or remarks. All right, we'll hold off on that. But for now, thank you, and God bless everybody.
Thank you, Mayor Trevino. Next, I would like to introduce you guys to the wonderful Ms. Tricia Cortez, the Executive Director of Rio Grande International Study Center, who will provide opening remarks to kick off this event.
Everybody, good evening. Muy bienvenidos. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos tonight. You're taking time out of your busy schedule with your lives, your families, to address this really, really significant public health threat that we have here in this city. I want to thank you, Mayor, for being here, and city leadership for being here. Just so everybody knows and has all of the full background, this work in Laredo started in the spring of 2021. We represent an environmental nonprofit, the Rio Grande International Study Center, that's been here for 30 years in Laredo, advocating on behalf of people, families, and our environment. And we started getting phone calls from investigative reporters, and we started getting calls from the EPA office of Region 6 in Dallas about things about ethylene oxide. We were not familiar with this. We didn't know what this was. We'd never heard of Midwest sterilization. And through that summer, through the help of Dr. Terrell, who's at Tulane University, she started to walk us through the EPA databases. And we started to realize how serious this problem is for Laredo, and about this company from Jackson, Missouri, that came in here in 2005 and had become one of the biggest emitters of this highly toxic cancer-causing chemical into the Laredo air. And there's about maybe 90 sterilizers in the country. Midwest always ranked kind of in the top 3, and they were putting into our air up to 15, 16, 17,000 pounds of this chemical that is toxic in such tiny amounts. And so because of that, we also learned from the EPA databases that the cancer level risk in Laredo was among the highest, in the highest percentiles in the country for a huge portion of the city, driven by one company, one facility located off of the Mines Road in the Killam Industrial Park, putting so many lives at risk. And so from that, we reached out immediately to Councilmember Perez, to Melissa, who was on our board at that time, to try to understand what was happening. We got in touch with Earth Justice, and because they've been working with other communities, especially communities of color in this country, that are faced with this burden by these companies. And so from that was born the Clean Air Laredo Coalition. And what is so unique about this is it is very rare in Laredo to have all the government institutions come together and be in agreement with community-based organizations like ours and people in the community. And ethylene oxide is one of those issues. City of Laredo, Webb County, LISD, UISD, they all took formal actions to join the Clean Air Laredo Coalition. This doesn't normally happen, right? And it did, because they realized how serious this is. In addition to that, they provided the funding to do the $200,000 fence line air monitoring study that you're going to learn about today. And since that time, there have been lawsuits where we as an organization represented by Earth Justice with other plaintiffs from across the country have sued the EPA. We're still involved in several lawsuits that you're going to learn about today as well. More than 1,000 people in Laredo last year, at the end of the year, more than 1,000 signed a petition that we then sent to EPA Region 6 in Dallas to make sure they come and help us. And I want to thank you, those of you in this audience who signed that petition, because it matters and they listened and they're paying attention to this. And the last thing I wanted to say is that there's so many people who care so deeply about this. There were 100 volunteers that went and put up flyers in 13 subdivisions just last week that Edgar organized, and people from our staff. If I could have all the interns, volunteers, and risk staff please stand for your help in putting all of this together. Thank you so much. So what we want to do tonight, we've given out index cards so you don't forget. You're going to have a chance to speak, ask your questions, give your thoughts and comments. We want you to do this. We're going to listen. The heart of today's meeting is for you to hear from these experts, scientists and attorneys, to learn about what we found out from this 7-week study, what is happening legally at the EPA in DC, and then what we want to do tonight is we want you all to help us with our city leadership here to say what you want. What are your expectations moving forward as a community here in South Texas to make sure that you and your families and your kids and their grandkids are protected and taken care of, because there must be accountability from industry. And we need not just our city leadership, but people at TCEQ that are not on the same page with us on this issue, and the people of the EPA who are. We need everybody to come together and demand that we have accountability and they work to protect our lives and our public welfare. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Trish. And now we are honored to have Ms. Councilwoman Vanessa Perez, who's been a big advocate of ethylene oxide for more than 3 years.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Tricia for all her hard work. When she got the phone call about ethylene oxide, she immediately sprung into action. And I had been receiving similar calls, so we kind of exchanged notes and we're like, what's going on here with this chemical plant? I had just come into office, and when I ran for office, I didn't even know that this was an issue. So it quickly became one of the top priorities for District 7, because when ProPublica came out, they met with us before they published their map, and they let us see just how far-reaching this chemical is. And so from a radius and a diameter standpoint, it goes from the Mines Road all the way down to Lafayette, you know, and all the way around in a big circle. So the effects are far-reaching. It's not just the Mines Road. It's not just a little piece of Laredo. It's a big chunk of Laredo. And so there is a lot of pollution in the air. This chemical is in the air. This study is very important, and I'm very thankful that Dr. Peltier came down here. It was Tricia's advocacy that got him down here to be able to explain the data. I did get to see some of it, and I could say it's a little bit complicated. So hopefully he can simplify it for all of us so we can understand, you know, exactly what's going on in our backyards. But I want to thank also the City Council. It was because the City Council, also the mayor, who quickly, unanimously jumped on board with this issue. Of course, I represent District 7, so this had to be something that was going to be very important for me as the representative to take on as a challenge and to help as much as I could to make sure that we did everything possible. We went to Washington in March. We advocated. When we went there, we were expecting the EPA to have their rule out, and they didn't have it out at that time. We learned that they were 8 years late in a revision, which was significant for our community because they were allowing these elevated levels of this chemical to be released into the air. You know, for those of you that might not understand what that means, this chemical is used to sterilize medical equipment, and it's released in a chamber. That chamber has scrubbers, which I'm not an expert, so they'll explain it. But whatever comes out of that stack is what comes into our air, and that's what we end up breathing in. You know, they were allowing a lot of this chemical to not have to be captured. We were arguing, why are we not capturing all of it? You know, and so we had to understand, and we struggled to understand, like, why would you even allow this to be released at all? It became known that it's a carcinogen, so it's not even a question of whether it does or does not cause cancer. It does. And we also learned that there's no safe level of it. So how is it that it's allowed to be emitted is something that I still don't fully understand. And I think that the rule that learning that the EPA was 8 years late, that they had meetings with every single region in the country except for Region 6, which is the southernmost part of the United States, which we questioned as, are we not important? Why are we in the southern part of the United States not as important as the rest of the country to at least give us the courtesy of letting us know that there's this issue in our communities? 8 years late that they were, and we had to fight, and thank you to Earth Justice for helping give more attention and advocacy to actually put pressure through the lawsuit that they filed. And thanks RISC for spearheading that. You know, that in March they came out with a rule that forces sterilizers to reduce the overall cancer risk and emissions by 90%, which is not a small task. That is a big step forward, but it's not. It's a big step forward, but it's not 100%. There's still that 10%, which is still a lot. And it doesn't address issues like, you know, off-gassing, fugitive emissions, which are other terms that they'll touch on tonight. But this issue is not over. This is still an ongoing fight. This is still an ongoing commitment that the city of Laredo, all the taxing entities, as Tricia pointed out, need to continue to work together, because at the end of the day, we're here to serve the community, and the community deserves clean air, clean water, and clean land. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Councilwoman Vanessa Perez. And now we will hear from Dr. Richard Chamberlain, Public Health Director for Laredo.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for your interest in air quality. It's really important for each and every one of you to be fully invested into what the municipal government, what we do here in the city of Laredo to protect the health and safety of every one of you all. And the Laredo Public Health Department has been working hand in hand with the Clean Air Laredo Coalition and Rio Grande International Study Center since they were made aware of this. We were made aware too. And as Tricia mentioned, none of us in this room knew about ethylene oxide. It wasn't something that was discussed often or freely or over dinner tables as it could be now. And that's very important for us to be able to have this level of awareness. While we, and of course at Rio Grande International Study Center, are no longer in the novice level of understanding of what ETO is, we have elevated our status in our education and our awareness, so that way we're able to do that for the members of our community. And we greatly appreciate the subject matter expertise that has been here with us, or in the virtual realm, like I said, the Hollywood Squares. Thank you to Dr. Terrell, that's up there, to be able to help provide us that additional level of expertise that we don't have here in the community, but that we continue to build upon so we are able to get to that level of expertise so that we're able to help continue educate the members of the city of Laredo. I did want to mention that while the city of Laredo did not have an air quality monitoring program in the past, thank you to the council, and this did start in 2002 where an air quality monitoring program was 2022, where the council did provide monies for an air quality monitoring program, but because of the importance of understanding the ethylene oxide situation, that money was redirected to Rio Grande International Study Center so that they can make sure to, or that they were able to put together the 7-week study that we're going to discuss today. That was definitely a great community-based organization, public partnership that needed to go through so that way we were able to get this type of data. But just most recently at the beginning of September, City Council also pushed through additional funds so that we're able to start up and maintain an air quality monitoring program, which will be for the 6 most common air pollutants that are widely known: carbon dioxide, particulate matter, but also will include routine ethylene oxide monitoring here in the community and specifically in the area of most concern. So that is a definite win for us as we'll continue to be able to provide that information to the members of the community and ultimately our policymakers to be able to drive any type of policy or new rule for the city of Laredo regarding emissions. As mentioned by the mayor just a few short moments ago, just to let the community or to further make the community aware, TCEQ was here in the city of Laredo the week of September 16th. I just want to make sure everybody knows that. They started ethylene oxide monitoring, and we made the request for them to share that information, that report, with us, of course, at Laredo Public Health, so we can help further disseminate that in our community. And also made the request, where is that information going to be posted, so that way everybody has access to it as well. So that was facilitated by the Senator Zaffarini's office, who included that into the 88th legislature for ETO funding for the city of Laredo, and now that is ongoing. So we will have TCEQ data. We don't know what the interval on that is just yet, but we will have more information, and we'll share that when we do get it. But we will be working towards starting this air quality monitoring program in the coming months, which will include the ethylene oxide monitoring. I will also share on behalf of the city council, which was a directive to the city manager and the administration team to send a letter to Midwest to get them into a room so that way we're able to play in the same sandbox together. It's really important for them to share their information, to share their data. We're not going to ask for that information to be done daily, but just putting that request out there so that we're able to share that with the members of our community, and that we ask for their transparency in their operation. So as that continues to materialize, we will make sure our council members are made aware, as well as the members of our community, and continue to count on public health to elevate and multiply with our foundational public health services and programs, which now include air quality monitoring. Thank you for your time.
So big shout out to all of our representatives for the support that you guys provide us. And I also want to give a special thank you to Sheila Serna. She's a former Rio Grande International Study Center staffer and TCEQ air specialist, for her role in the early stages that have allowed us to continue this fight and bringing us here tonight. So thank you, Sheila. I know where you're at. Okay, so now it's time to get started with our presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Kimberly Terrell from New Orleans at Tulane University Environmental Law Clinic. She will explain what ETO is and why it is such a serious threat to our community.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be with you, even if it's remotely. I wish I could be there in person. I really appreciate everybody's patience, and I'm going to just talk briefly for about 5 minutes about some of the basics of ethylene oxide. I think by this point, everybody is aware that ethylene oxide is highly toxic, that it's a colorless gas that we can't see. For anyone who's heard of benzene, which is another toxic pollutant, ethylene oxide is 400 times more toxic than benzene. So it's a very potent cancer-causing chemical. Long-term exposure to ethylene oxide is linked to lymphoma, breast cancer, birth defects, respiratory harm, and central nervous system damage. So there's a lot of different harms that can be inflicted by long-term exposure to this chemical. One of the reasons why ethylene oxide is such a problem is because it's a very small molecule that can travel long distances. And it also takes months to break down naturally in the air. So ethylene oxide only survives for a few weeks in the water, but in the air, for half of it to break down takes between 2 and 5 months. So what a facility emits today can affect people, for weeks or months to come. Ethylene oxide mostly enters the body through the lungs, where it gets into the bloodstream. And the same properties that make it a good sterilizer also make it dangerous to human health. Ethylene oxide is a very reactive molecule. It's very unstable. And when it interacts with DNA and protein, it can alter the structure of that DNA and protein. And that's the same thing it does to bacteria. So it's important to understand that ethylene oxide doesn't know if it's attacking bacterial DNA or human DNA. And it's also important to keep in mind that the ethylene oxide that people have already been exposed to will affect their risk of developing health problems later in life. It's a lot like smoking cigarettes. So your doctor will ask you not only how much do you smoke now, but how much did you used to smoke? And in the same way, that past exposure to ethylene oxide is carried with people. It can be it can be impossible to know if we're being exposed because we can't see this chemical and it has a very high odor threshold. So people with a good sense of smell can detect ethylene oxide at 250 parts per million or above. The level that EPA says equates to a 1 in 10,000 cancer risk, which is kind of what EPA considers the maximum cancer risk that's acceptable, is just under 11 parts per trillion. So that means that the odor threshold is 25 million times higher than that acceptable cancer risk level. So clearly we can't rely on our noses to keep us safe from ethylene oxide. We also know that we can't rely on industry reported data on its own. There was a study that came out a couple months ago where researchers from Johns Hopkins University came down to Louisiana and measured levels of ethylene oxide in 13 census tracts. It's an area about 40 miles. And in every single census tract, the level of ethylene oxide was higher than what EPA said it would be based on the reported emissions. So, the most likely explanation is that the emissions are underreported. And in fact, in Louisiana, when EPA realized that ethylene oxide was more toxic than it had previously thought, we saw companies retroactively change their reported emissions. So all of that to say that if we want to understand the risk from ethylene oxide, the best way to do that is to directly measure people's exposure. And so with that, I want to pass it off to Dr. Peltier because I think, he's got the information that everybody's really interested in tonight. So thank you so much for your attention, and hopefully I will get to meet you all in person someday. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Rick Peltier. I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts. I live in Western Massachusetts, and I just arrived here last night, and I've had 18 hours of a wonderful time being in this community. I've never been to Laredo before, but it really has been a remarkable experience. I want to talk about this study that I participated in as somebody who engaged in the project after the project was essentially done. My role here is a little different than somebody who goes out and collects measurements and maybe sets up a design for a study, maybe investigates what's happening in a factory. My role was to just analyze the data that was coming in and to get that. No, they're just open windows here. There we go. And as we all know, this was a project that was driven by community concerns. People were worried because we had this new scary molecule that was found in our cities. Laredo, as unfortunately, is not alone. There are many cities across the United States where we see ethylene oxide across our communities in places that we never really expected to find it, but it's been there all along. The work was performed largely by a contractor, somebody who's qualified to go out and collect these measurements and then send them to a laboratory where they use sophisticated equipment to measure the ethylene oxide in the samples that were collected. But my role is that of an atmospheric scientist. I'm a chemist by training. I study air pollution and how it changes in the world, but I also study public health. My research is in exposure science and how you and I might get sick from many of the things that are in our air. And so Dr. Terrell said that the nose doesn't really know. In fact, that's quite true. Our detection from our nose is really quite poor for something like ethylene oxide. Instead, we use a device that looks like this. This is known as a SUMA canister. A SUMA canister is nothing more, it's a very threatening looking device, but it's really nothing more than a big stainless steel vessel. And it's hollow, there's nothing on the inside. In fact, there's a vacuum. And a contractor would then take this device and turn that little knob just a tiny bit and allow air to leak into that little chamber over about 24 hours of time. So about a whole day of time. That's a really nice way to do that because we know there's nothing inside that canister, and the only thing that goes in is air from wherever you're sampling this device. The problem with this, though, is, thank you. The problem with this strategy is that it takes one canister to make one measurement in one location over 24 hours, and a whole lot can happen during that time period. The winds can shift, emissions can change, everything can go sideways. Perhaps it rains, perhaps the sun comes out. All kinds of things occur during that 24-hour period. But then at the end of the day, the contractor will return. He or she will send that to a laboratory where it's analyzed by a sophisticated piece of equipment to measure the amount of ethylene oxide. The challenge for ETO measurements are that it depends on where you're located. A canister, this little device, and in this case, the city of Laredo deployed somewhere between about 7 canisters at a time in different locations around this facility. It depends on where you are. The closer you are, if you're in the right direction or the wrong direction. So if you installed a canister here, you wouldn't see anything for this forest fire. I'm not talking about forest fires and ethylene oxide, I'm using it as an example. However, you come to a very different conclusion if you are here. Because of the position in which you are physically located, you come to very different conclusions. In reality, it's not quite this black and white, if you will. It's not that you're downwind or not downwind. In reality, as we all know, our winds shift all day long. Sometimes they blow from the south, sometimes they blow from the west, sometimes they blow from the north. And so that means that the ethylene oxide that's coming from any site, any emission source, will change the direction it goes. Dr. Terrell talked about how long this molecule lasts in the atmosphere, months, which means if a molecule of ethylene oxide is released from an emission source, a facility or a plant, it's going to travel for months, meaning it is a global pollutant. It travels everywhere the wind blows it. So how did we get here? Why are we so breathless about ethylene oxide right now? Well, ethylene oxide is a very old molecule. It's been around for about 100 years. It's a really useful sterilizing molecule. It does a great job killing bugs on medical devices and spices and all the things that we want to have clean and sterile. And it's been around for a very long time. However, in the 1980s, it was deemed as, reasonably anticipated as a carcinogen. That's a very kind of gobbledygook way to describe it. It probably causes cancer, but we can't be sure. It moved forward through a new review process. The EPA is required to review how toxic these molecules are every few years, and it was indeed reviewed in 1998. It went through a whole bunch of sets of time periods, but then in 2016, the EPA had accumulated enough research to say, you know what? This isn't reasonably anticipated to cause cancer. It does cause cancer. And that subtle change in the designation of cancer or cancer risk for ethylene oxide changed our view of risk to people who live around an ethylene oxide emission source. And so it's that moment right there when the story changed. But you'll also notice there's a fairly large gap here. Not a whole lot happened in the next 8 or 10 years. What did change is that in 2018, the National Air Toxics Assessment, the NATA report, which is the basis of where are the most toxic pollutants in the United States, was released, showing these little hot spots all over the country because it had to use this new determination that this molecule was hazardous to us. So here's a brief overview map of what we're talking about. Midwest Sterilizer Corporation's right there. You have this industrial park, which many of you are familiar with. And the contractor who operated this developed a total of six sites plus a background location. These 6 sites are to the north and to the south, and it depends on these listed right here: canister 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The same thing right here. We have what's called alternative sites for when the weather was not quite cooperating. At the same time, it's a little hard to see on this projection, there were 2 established background sites. These are sites that are nowhere near Midwest. They are what's happening in our local community. These sites were here and again over here. The problem is the wind changes all the time. We have winds moving from the southeast to the northwest on average. It changes all the time, but on average, that's what we see. So it makes a lot of sense for a contractor to stick their canisters, these samplers, to the north and west of this facility. So what do we see? Well, this is the data, and this is a little data heavy, but I'm gonna try to make it as reachable to all of you. I wanna make sure that you all get this message. What we have here on the top are the canisters, the average concentration of the canisters at canister 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. On the bottom are the alternative sites, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. As you move from left to right, you're getting further away from that plant. What you see is this trend where the concentration tends to drop with distance. You might draw a conclusion that says, well, canister 6, which was about 3/4 of a mile away from Midwest, canister 6, the concentration is 0. It's not 0, and I'll show you why in just a couple of minutes. At the same time, these are the background concentrations that were measured. These are the 2 sites that are very, very far away from Midwest. And they are closer to 0, but they're not 0. We found that background average of 0.05 parts per billion, 0.05, 0.07, depends on which site you're talking about. A fairly low concentration. But that's the equivalent of 50 to 70 parts per trillion. And as we just learned, that threshold for risk is 11 parts per trillion. And that's a tiny number, but even in a background site, we're still seeing concentrations that are already elevated in Laredo. That canister 1 average, that's 5.5 to 6 parts per billion. Okay? That's 5,500 to 6,000 parts per trillion. A little bit higher than 11, isn't it? The furthest site away, which is canister 6, on the order of 0.2 to 0.25 parts per billion. That's 200 to 250 parts per trillion. These are very high concentrations even at the furthest sample away. So these concentrations do decline with distance, and that does happen, we know that, but they're not 0. And they're still much above the background concentrations because we know that that distance is important. As you move away from a facility, the concentration falls down. It gets lower and lower. That's something we are very familiar with in the atmospheric chemistry world. but it also depends on wind direction and wind speed. Remember, these are 24-hour canister samples that did not move. They were installed in one place, and they were turned on, and they were left there for 24 hours. And within that 24-hour period, maybe they were downwind of the plant. Maybe they weren't. We can't be sure. That's one of the limitations of this kind of study. Here's that technical gobbledygook that Vanessa talked about. This is what we call a polar plot, and I'm not going to go into the gory details of what this is. Each little cross you see here is a sample location. That's where our canister was living for a period of time. And the color scale tells us where the concentration is highest, what direction the wind was blowing during that time period, and how fast the wind was blowing. It tells us a lot of information. And the work I do helps to interpret this really complicated story here. We see Midwest right here in the middle, to reduce this to something a little simpler with a cartoon graphic where we're going to scale out a little bit. And we're going to show you what that concentration profile looked like. Across that residential area, that industrial area, we had the furthest north canister was roughly at the margins of this industrial park. And we see concentrations declining with distance. We know that they're generally moving from southeast to northwest because that's the way the wind blows in Laredo for the most part. We know that at the margins of these locations right here, the concentration was not background. It was not 11 parts per trillion. It was 200 or 250 parts per trillion, which means that those molecules that were still there at the edge of the industrial park continued to move wherever the wind blew them. Where do they blow them? They blew them here. For the most part, the wind blows from southeast to northwest about 85% of the time. It does vary. And then from the other direction is towards the southeast about 15% of the time. It varies year to year. But generally speaking, those emissions that we see coming from here are moving to the north and west and declining with distance. How far do they go? Dr. Terrell talked about how long those last in the atmosphere. They do not disappear. They just dilute with time, and so they travel for hundreds of miles. How do we do? Well, this is a different kind of study. We're looking at what are called a fence line measurement. The fence line measurement is the closest measurement you can have to the facility. The fence line is literally at the fence of the plant. And a number of studies in the United States have done this. What I've blocked out here is what we saw at the fence line measurements here in Laredo. In general, the concentration was somewhere around here, about 5.5 or so parts per billion. I've drawn a little dashed line that will continue to the left in just a few moments. How did we do? Well, this is what we see in Laredo at the fence line. That's that background measurement that this project measured. The US EPA also measured ethylene oxide, and sometimes in the same places. What did they see? Well, it's kind of a boring study, but they did the same thing. EPA saw pretty much exactly the same thing that this RISC project and the City of Laredo project saw. It's kind of not much to see here, because they saw the similar average concentration. Their background levels were slightly different, but they were pretty much the same. That gives us some confidence that what we're seeing in this study is what everybody else would see. That's a good thing. How about Atlanta? There are a number of facilities in Atlanta. That was one of the first groups to start looking at ethylene oxide and performing research. It was mainly the Environmental Protection Division, the EPD, the Georgia EPD, that did this work. They see concentrations at the Becton Dickinson and Sterilization Services America and Sterigenics, as well as their background sites here. They didn't see a whole lot difference, to be honest with you. The concentrations were elevated over background, but not a lot. But all of them are lower than what you saw in Laredo. All of them. One more. In Gurnee, outside of Chicago, to the north of Chicago, much lower concentrations. These are fence line measurements of ethylene oxide. And so, unfortunately, Laredo, in this case, is a standout concentration. The concentrations we saw in this study are much higher than any other place we've seen. So here's the question. What is a safe level? What is safe for me and my family? Well, the most honest answer I could give you is 0. That's the safe level. But it's not a practical level, and we're always faced with making risk decisions. What level of risk are we willing to tolerate? There's conflict with the way the EPA regulates this versus TCEQ versus the state of Georgia. Historically, the US EPA said 11 parts per trillion, 10.9 if you want to be totally precise. And that's what they've always said. But they've sort of backed away from that, in part because they don't really know. They're still working on this science, but historically, that's the value they've used. The state of Georgia chose a value that was about 45 times lower than what EPA said, meaning that it's much more protective of public health. And there is no standard in Texas. So that's a challenge that we faced. How do we get to that 11 parts per trillion? And the other question is, can we get to those 11 parts per trillion? We often see many industries point to other kinds of regulations as the beacon for what we should aspire for. And it's very common for many industries to use occupational and safety and health administration values. These are worker safety guidelines for people who work in a sterilizer plant. Those are never appropriate for community exposures. Communities are full of all sorts of people who are old, who are sick, who are young, who are pregnant, who are just going about their day. And so we generally require or need much more protective concentrations for the general community compared to somebody like a worker who tends to be healthier. So what does 11 parts per trillion look like? Well, it's pretty small. As we all know, the Olympics just finished up. Here's the Olympic swimming pool in Paris, where we saw a lot of great swimming happen this past summer. If you imagine the volume of water in this Olympic swimming pool right here, and you took one little humble penny and tossed it into that one pool, that's 11 parts per trillion. That's the amount, the volume of ethylene oxide relative to the volume of air, in this case water, that you need to aim for. So you're talking about extraordinarily small amounts of ethylene oxide. It's really, really hard to get there. It's a challenge that I don't know how to solve, but it's going to take the resolve of the community, of the industries, of regulators to work together to get there. For those of you who aren't into swimming, like I am, imagine if you had a bank account with $1 billion in it. And for the record, I do not have a bank account with $1 billion in it, just so you know. That's like putting 11 cents in that bank account. 11 cents. Something that we often just sort of, we see a few pennies on the ground, we'll ignore. If you were a billionaire, you put 11 cents in, that's the equivalent of 11 parts per trillion. What do we see is the wrap up. Well, we see that the concentrations were definitely elevated all the way up to the fence line, beyond the fence line, and to the margins of where the sampling occurred, really at the edge of that industrial park. We saw concentrations that were 4 to 5 times higher than background concentrations at the edge of that industrial park. And those emissions will certainly decay and go down as you move further and further away. But ultimately, they don't go to zero. You wind up with that background that you see even in those remote locations. So that ethylene oxide persists and it stays, and it can affect us. But as Dr. Terrell talked about, these exposures to ethylene oxide, even before they were deemed carcinogenic, already were carcinogenic. The only thing that changed is the body of scientific evidence that gives us the confidence to say this is carcinogenic. It doesn't mean the exposures that families or children or older people had 10 years ago and 20 years ago didn't lead to cancers. We just didn't have the confidence to say that this is carcinogenic. Those exposures will persist and you'll carry forward, much like the narrative that Dr. Terrell talked about cigarette smoking, how your physician will ask you what you smoke today and what you used to smoke in the past, because those past exposures affect your health today and into the future. And then the other challenge is, where does this ethylene oxide come from? Sure, it comes from a sterilizer plant, there's no doubt about it, and it probably comes in some fraction from the stacks that come out of the top of these sterilizer chambers. But to be honest, we know a fair amount about that, and in fact, they're often audited by the companies or by TCEQ in the state of Texas. We have a generally good understanding of what's coming out of those stacks. It's probably not coming from leaking pipes or barrels that are cracked that have ethylene oxide in it, but it's almost surely coming from many of the sterilized goods that we rely on that are coated with this ethylene oxide as they use their sterilization approach to clean these products. The question is, what do we do about it? And that's where it gets really hard. We know where the sterilizers are. So does the company. We know how much ethylene oxide is going into them and how much ethylene oxide is coming out of them. But what we don't know is all of these other things, these products that have been sterilized that continue to off-gas after they've been sterilized. And so it's something that is very challenging for us. It's complicated. It's something that none of us can detect in our lives, but it's all around us, and we have to do something about it. With that, pass it back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peltier. That was awesome. I can't explain it like he does. So last but not least, we have Marvin C. Brown, Senior Attorney with Earth Justice, and he will talk about legal and current updates. Here.
And then there's a video. Can I test if the audio works? Okay, we don't need the audio. I will explain it, but it should be open. It's right here. Perfect. Close this one. Perfect. You can just expand it. Awesome. Awesome. Now let me just cue it up here. All right. Okay, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here today. Always enjoy coming down to Laredo. My boss likes to joke that he wants to just send me here permanently so that he doesn't have to pay for the flights all the time. I'm here. My name is Marvin Brown. I am an attorney at Earth Justice. My focus is mostly on air quality issues. I lead our work on commercial sterilizers. I also do a lot of work on particulate matter, which I know is another issue in Laredo. I do a lot of work on ozone, and I also do some work on some other climate-related issues. Tonight I want to talk to you about the commercial sterilizer rule. This is a rule that is a long time coming, and it took a lot of fighting, and it literally took risk suing EPA to get this done. And I really want to emphasize how much the local community here in Laredo pushed EPA to actually regulate this chemical and reduce emissions. It's a major success. And so I really want to thank all of you, because I know a lot of you reached out to local EPA officials in Dallas at EPA Region 6. Some of you wrote comment letters during the public comment period for the new rule. And I can tell you, because I have read EPA's response to comments, they noted them. And in between the proposal and the final rule, they even strengthened the rule in a way that we often do not see. I work on rules all the time. They often get weaker. They rarely get stronger, and that's thanks to the work that you guys have put into this. So tonight we're going to go through the new sterilizer rule. I'll talk about how it relates to the old rule, why the old rule was so weak, how the new rule is better. But I do want to emphasize that because we have a new rule, that's not, the fight isn't over. There's a lot more work to do. And as Dr. Peltier just said, there's a lot of emissions that are still uncontrolled that we need to control. And so I'm thankful for the engagement that everyone has had on this. And I want to let you know that unfortunately there's still more work to do. So let's first talk a little bit about some of the success that we've had. As Dr. Peltier pointed out, in 2016, EPA makes a very significant finding that ethylene oxide is significantly more carcinogenic than they previously thought, and not just, significantly more carcinogenic, it is carcinogenic. The new level is about 60 times more carcinogenic than what they previously thought it was. They didn't do anything. They were required to update their sterilizer rule in 2014. This rule was first put into place in 1994. It had never been updated. In fact, in between 1994 and 2018, it actually just continually got weaker. They removed some of the controls that were supposed to be at some of these facilities. And so in 2022, RISC sued EPA in the DC Court of Appeals, in the DC District Court, and was able to get a settlement with EPA that put them on a deadline. I can confirm to you they would not have done this rule if it was not for RISC suing them. I know because I've talked to them, and they really pushed, this settlement really did push them over the finish line. So it was very important that RISC did this. As a result of that, let's talk about the new rule. So first, a little bit about the old rule. Originally promulgated in 1994, it assumed that there were only 3 sources of emissions at a commercial sterilizer facility, and let's go through what commercial sterilization looks like, because it is a little bit of a weird process. So, I'm going to narrate it myself. So, this is a commercial sterilizer. It begins with a preconditioning process, but the part that we really want to get into is this process here. This is a commercial sterilizer sterilization chamber. The products that a commercial sterilizer sterilizes come to the facility completely finished. We're talking about its final, product as you would receive it when you go to a hospital or when you go to an urgent care center. It's in its box, it's shrink wrapped, it's on a pallet. And one of the, as Rick or Dr. Peltier was just saying, remember, one tiny chemical in a swimming pool. Well, because it is so small, it is able to penetrate through the shrink wrap, penetrate through the boxes, and sterilize the products. And so it is put in a vacuum sealed chamber. This chamber then sucks out all of the air at the chamber. And before the sterilization process begins, nitrogen is pumped into the chamber to prepare the materials. And we are now going to get to the part, this is not the sterilization part. This video has a really nice red color that they use for sterilization and ethylene oxide, and here it is. It is pumped from a canister where it is generally in liquid form. It's then converted into a gas. It is pumped into the sterilization chamber. And as it is pumped in, it sits there for a certain period of time, depending on the products. This is called a dwell time. After the product has been sterilized, it is then pumped back out. And so this, we're going to see 3 parts of the rule and that are important. The first part is the sterilization chamber vent. So this is the vent that removes the ethylene oxide from the sterilization chamber. And so that's what you see here is the sterilization chamber vent. Now, the next part that EPA in 2006 removed, remember I mentioned they weakened the rule. In 2006, they removed all of the requirements for facilities to have to control this next part here, which is, and you will see in this video, the door just opens. There was no control to control the emissions that was coming from the door just opening. So this would have been called the chamber exhaust vent. After the product has been removed from the chamber, it is then placed into an aeration room. And part of the problem with using ethylene oxide as a sterilization method is it tends to dwell on a product long after it has gone through this process. And before it can be shipped out, it needs to aerate for a little bit. That's called off-gassing. And so a every sterilization facility has to place sterilized products in an aeration room to aerate, and those emissions are captured, and that's called the aeration room vent, so ARV. However, EPA estimates that about 1% of the ethylene oxide that is used at a facility remains on the product long after it leaves the facility. So if you can imagine, 1% doesn't sound like that much. But if you have a lot of products all sitting together, that 1% starts to add up very quickly. And so those are considered to be fugitive emissions. And as you can see, what's really great about this industry video is, as you can see, there's a lot of areas that are just uncontrolled. It's just sitting in the room. There's no controls for any of these sort of fugitive emissions here. So if we go back to our new rule, and some of, let's see here, some of the big changes that we've seen. So first, let's talk about the old sterilizer rule. I've put in bold on the slides the types of controls that a facility the size of Midwest would likely have to meet. Unfortunately, we don't know the full types of controls that they might have done recently. It's a little bit unclear the types of controls that they might have had in the past, but these are the types of controls that EPA would have required them to meet up until April of this year. So as you can see, for facilities that use more than 10 tons of ETO, which is a pretty large amount, those are considered to be your larger facilities, they were required to control their emissions at their sterilization chamber vents. That was that part in the beginning, which was removing ethylene oxide. They were required to cover their emissions from their aeration room vents. So that was that last part that we saw in the video. But if you remember, when the door opened, no control. So let's go and look at the new rule. So let's first begin with the sterilization chamber vents. One big difference in this rule compared to the last rule is EPA changed the categories of facilities and how the types of controls that they have to do. So whereas before, facilities that use less than 1 ton of ethylene oxide generally didn't have to do anything at all. Facilities that used between 1 and 10 had some controls, and facilities that used more than 10 all had the same controls. Now it is based off of facilities that generally use more than 30 tons, although sometimes it goes up to 400 tons for certain parts. But a facility like Midwest generally uses more than 30 tons of ethylene oxide. So for the sterilization chamber vents, EPA strengthened the standards that they are required to meet by about 100 times. It's a pretty big improvement, specifically on the sterilization chamber vents. And actually, this is a part of the rule that was strengthened between the proposal and the final. The proposal, I believe, was at 99.98, and they moved it up to 99.99. It seems like a small amount, but it's actually a pretty huge difference in controls that are going to be required. The chamber exhaust vents. So remember, there were no controls for that. They are now going to have to control those emissions. And I put it in bold for both because it's unclear if Midwest is going to, go below 400 tons. But even if they are, it is likely that they're going to still have to meet the same standard. So we're now going to have controls for the chamber exhaust vents. Finally, the aeration room vents. It's about a 10-fold increase in the types of controls or the amount of emissions that a facility like Midwest is going to have to control. Now, we've talked a lot about fugitive emissions. These are emissions that occur at a facility that aren't necessarily tied to a specific point source. So for example, we know the sterilization chamber vent, when that opens, we know the emission is coming directly from there. Same with when the door opens, the chamber exhaust vent. Fugitive emissions are a little bit different. We know that, for example, some ETO sometimes leak in the process of transferring it from the container that it's in into the sterilization chamber. We know that ethylene oxide, as we mentioned, tends to off-gas long after it has been sterilized. And so anytime it's held in storage, it tends to, or sterilized product is held in storage, there can still be emissions that are occurring from that sterilized product. So, for the very first time, EPA is requiring facilities to control their emissions and to control their fugitive emissions. The important part here is this only occurs for emissions that occur on site. It does not occur for, or it does not apply to emissions that occur offsite in an offsite warehouse. So group 1 emissions are the types of fugitive emissions that occur from the process of moving ethylene oxide from a barrel that it's sitting in into the sterilization chamber. Group 2 emissions will cover all storage facility that occur at the facility itself. So on-site storage of products. So if Midwest or any other sterilization facility has a large warehouse that is on the facility, they have to control those emissions as a group 2 emission. There's in terms of the types of compliance that they're going to have to do, there's two big parts to know about this new rule. The first one is a major change, which is in addition to controlling these emissions, they're going to have to install what's called a permanent total enclosure system. Essentially, it is a vacuum sealed version of the building where they have to control all of the emissions within that building. They then have to monitor the emissions that are occurring at the building with a continuous emissions monitoring system. Before, the way a facility like Midwest or any other sterilizer facility would work is they would just conduct a performance test of their sterilization chamber vent or of their aeration room vent, and they would be required to conduct these tests every few months. Now facilities are going to have to continuously monitor the amount of ethylene oxide that they have, and not only are they supposed to monitor it, they have to report that data to EPA. That data will be reported to EPA on a quarterly basis and then available to the public. So it's a major shift and one that we've been pushing for a long time and we're very excited about. However, like I said, fight's not over. Just this past July, the Ethylene Oxide Sterilization Association sued EPA to try and get them to undo this rule. And so now we are representing risk in that lawsuit and in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. I think we have a pretty good shot, but we will see. And we'll continue fighting to make sure that this rule stays in place. In addition to this rule, as Dr. Pelletier mentioned, these sterilized products continue to off-gas. And one of the areas where we unfortunately don't know too much about is where the warehouses are outside of the Midwest facility where sterilized products are being stored. And that is another area that we're going to continue to push EPA to control those emissions. We've gotten a commitment from them that they are going to conduct what's called an information collection request, where they send out it literally is sort of like a subpoena, but it's not a subpoena, but you have to answer it because it's a legal document that requires facilities to tell them about the size of the facility, how much ethylene oxide do they think they're emitting, and then the next step is to push EPA to finally regulate these facilities because they literally exist all across the country. facility or any city that has a hospital or an urgent care center probably has a warehouse that is storing medical products, and it might be emitting ethylene oxide. So it's an incredibly important development as we push in the near future to get EPA to regulate these offsite warehouses. But I want to say it is really thanks to the work of folks in Laredo that we were able to get this new sterilizer rule and get the types of controls that we expect to see. And I forgot to mention, the one part of the rule that we're very much not excited about is the timeline for compliance. We pushed EPA to require facilities to comply within 90 days of the rule being made effective, so that would have been 90 days from April 5th. Unfortunately, EPA has given facilities 2 years. So a facility like Midwest is unlikely to, or is not required to be in full compliance with the new rule until April 5th, 2026. So in terms of things folks can do, there is still a lot of work to push Midwest to comply faster. There is no reason why they need to wait 2 years to comply. And so there's still a lot of work that can be done locally to control these emissions. And with that, I'll hand it back to Edgar.
Thank you so much, Marvin. And thank you to all of our speakers for their insight and expertise. In a few moments, we're gonna give you guys the opportunity to ask any questions. It's not every day that we have people out here from Washington, from Massachusetts. We got the experts here, so we encourage you guys to ask your questions, ask your technical questions, anything that you might not understand or that you didn't get from the presentation. Now's that moment. We're gathered here for this exact reason. So I guess in an order, we're gonna have our interns helping us pass out the mics. And yeah, we'll try to keep order of who's raising their hands first. That way we could get everybody's questions answered.
It'll take about 15 minutes for Q&A so that we can put together some next steps that our community wants.
Okay. So yeah, we're gonna try to wrap up the Q&A session in like 15 minutes. That's how long we'll give for questions. So let's try to yeah, let's try to get this going.
Preguntas.
Testing. Hello. Yes, my question is, does this chemical also cause birth defects, and does it get into the water? You know, because our river here is considered one of the top 10 most polluted rivers in the world. So, you know, and people still drink the water from the river. So, who can answer that?
Is it?
Thank you for the question. Whoa, goodness. Yes, they are. So the question about birth defects, we don't really have any good evidence that points to birth defects. We haven't seen strong evidence. That doesn't mean there aren't birth defects to detect with ethylene oxide exposures, but we just don't have strong evidence. And so the best answer I can give you is we don't know. In terms of how it gets into the water, it does get into water. In fact, it's highly soluble in water. And that's the primary way in which it leaves the atmosphere, mainly through rainfall. And it does fall into the water and get into our water systems. However, one important difference is that when it's in the water, it doesn't last very long. It reacts away in a few days. It's still there, it's not zero, but unlike what happens in the atmosphere where it can persist for months, it lasts for hours to days in the water.
Marley, do you want to speak? Marley?
Hi, my name is Marley, and I made this poster because I knew there was going to be a presentation. So, and I made it because, like, I don't want to get cancer. You don't want to get cancer. None of us want to get cancer. So, that's the reason my mom is doing this organization. She doesn't want any of us to get hurt. And well, back then, like they said in the 80s, they didn't really care. They didn't really care about the future. That's what happens when we don't care about the future. Ethylene oxide is a very dangerous chemical that they said can be in air, water, and can harm a lot of people. And my mom is trying to prevent that, and we're doing the best we can, but some people just don't care about Laredo. Some people are just hurting Laredo. And we're not the only ones who have this problem. There are other people who have this problem. And there are a lot of people in Laredo who have had deaths caused by ethylene oxide. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mama. And she did that on her own. I just wanted to mention all of the comments you make. We're taking notes because we want to put together our community demand list to push this forward for next steps. And I think you had a question?
Just a quick question. Is there any safer alternatives to ethylene oxide? There are.
There are multiple safer alternatives to ethylene oxide. The one that we have been trying to push FDA to require more of is hydrogen peroxide. Surprisingly, the same hydrogen peroxide that you can get at Target or Walmart is also a very effective sterilizer for medical products. In the past, I think it was August of last year, the FDA finally accepted hydrogen peroxide as a alternative method and recognizes it and recognized a new standard for using it. Now the focus is on pushing companies to adopt it.
Hello? Oh, over here. Hi. I just had a question about, like, has there been any audits, like, for their personnel? If there's been any, like, checking up of, like, if they're the ones that closest risk to it, if they've been, like, what their kind of, like, exposure, their, like, any readings from that? And a little second part question to that, too, is given that it's not, like, regulated or wasn't regulated and will be till, like, 2026, is there anything that can be done to, like, fast track either through the EPA or the state to, like, kind of, like, stop and, like, adjust, or is it just really going to wait till, like, 2 years down the line for them to adapt? Thank you.
Yeah. So on the workers, I'm not aware of any specific study that was done for the workers here. There is a separate action that EPA has been doing in addition to the sterilizer rule that we've been working on. That is called, it's essentially the pesticide registration for ethylene oxide. Because it is used to sterilize products and it kills pathogens, that is, under the law, a pesticide. As part of the pesticide action that EPA has been pursuing, they estimated that about 1 in 17 workers at a facility are likely to develop cancer because of the exposure to ethylene oxide. That new FIFRA action, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, is likely going to be completed sometime this year. We're still waiting for it to be finalized, and that will include new protections specifically for workers. But it does, and it also does include some protections for the community as well, but it includes the worker protections that are not included in this rule. This rule is mostly about community exposure rather than the internal worker exposure. In terms of fast tracking the facility, I think a lot of that, unfortunately from a legal standpoint, there's not much that can be done at the moment. However, there's a lot of political pressure that can be put onto a facility to get them to comply faster. And that's things that can be done locally, but in terms of EPA, because they have unfortunately given them 2 years to comply, there's nothing at the moment that can be done in getting them to comply faster.
Excuse me, I have a question. Are these companies located mostly in low-income communities, or how do they decide where to set up?
I guess I can partially answer that question. First, I want to say that no matter what I say, I cannot compete with Marley and her poster. So these facilities there are roughly 90 large sterilizing facilities in the United States, and they exist not necessarily in low-income communities, but often they do. They are an industrial product that often are found in industrial parks, which are often located around marginalized populations. That's not always true. There are some that are in urban environments. Gurney, for example, is not in a low-income community. Gurney in Chicago, outside of Chicago. But the Sterigenics facilities in Chicago were. You can pick on individual facilities by all means, but there's no automatic location which you put this in a low-income community. They are where the products need to be sterilized and then eventually used. We've seen them in rural areas. We've seen them in urban areas. They are really diverse in their location. So it's not explicitly connected to low-income communities, but it often is.
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt Dr. Peltier and Mr. Brown, but the question I have is more directed towards Ms. Cortez or any of our city council members that are present and might be able to answer. On the RISC website, there is a mention of a facility in northern United States that was also emitting ETO, and they were emitting, I think, like 15 times less than what was the emissions that are recorded in Laredo, and they got shut down right off the bat. The city did not allow it. And so in Laredo, we've had this company established since 2005, if I'm not mistaken, and we have 15 times the emissions that that other company was doing. And as from my understanding and through this presentation, there was a grant given to the city of Laredo not to shut down the company, but to have air monitor established here, low-cost air monitors established. And I assume that the reason to do that is to be able to get better data, to be able to fight a better case, have better projects and legislation established. And so my question is, if I'm not mistaken, I think that grant was given to the city of Laredo like a year ago. And from my understanding, in August of this year, they still tabled it and basically said, we're not ready to talk about that yet, and we're not ready to make a decision. It wasn't until I think about a week or two, maybe 3 ago, that they finally said out of the 19 air monitors that we have, we're implementing only 2. Even though, again, this has been an issue since 2005, and we're 15 times over another company that has already been established, and we have people like you that are coming to tell us how cancerous our air is and how we're basically like 200 times the legal limit on a federal level. And so I would like to ask, the city of Laredo, how we're going to combat that and how we're going to actually make it an urgent issue, because we understand as citizens that it is something that we need to do now. But it seems that, quite honestly, maybe I'm ignorant and I don't understand, but it seems as if there's other issues that are more present to some of our representatives.
So Melissa Cigarroa, City of Laredo Council Member for District 3. Just off the top of your bat, when you're talking about the most recent air monitoring discussions that we've had at Council, there were 2 things going on, right? The $75,000 study that came from the Border Economic Cooperation Commission was also a risk project that had to do with particulate matter 2.5. So that should be separated from this, which is ethylene oxide. We have many challenges in our community, but that particular grant that you're talking about was for a different pollution problem. Oh, this is the 2.5 particulate matter sensor that we've been talking about at City Council. So very separate from ethylene oxide collection, and even the way you collect it, the way you analyze the data, what you're looking for. The study that Dr. Peltier explained was a study funded, organized by RISC and the Clean Air Laredo Coalition, funded by the City of Laredo, Webb County, LISD, UISD, everybody coming together. And that was a real effort by RISC and the Clean Air Laredo Coalition to approach those organizations and make sure that we would have good data. And because of all that work, EPA Region 6 came in and said, you know what? We're going to make sure that your data you're collecting is good data. And they came behind this study, and they also set up canisters. And so that creates more pressure because they confirmed the data that was presented in this study. So we have a stronger case. What can we do, though? That's where, when you talk about the company in Illinois that was shut down, that was a Sterigenics plant, and they had a long history of operating next to a neighborhood. A lot of cancer studies were done, and they found out how much cancer was there because they had been operating for decades. So when you look at ethylene oxide and the exposure and the danger from it, it is dangerous, but it is dangerous because of constant exposure. So you're talking decades, and they say about 2 decades to see breast cancer become more prevalent, about 2 to 3 decades to see the lymphomas and other cancers become more prevalent. It's not acceptable, but it's a long period of time. And that community had had that plant operating for years, for decades, and saw those things. They are a case study. If you want to know why we shouldn't have this plant operating over a long period of time, it's because that, in that community, you saw the impact of it operating. Now, you know, also back then, there were no controls. So there was an extreme amount of ethylene oxide that was released to the community. And, you know, while it's still high, what we're seeing now, it's much better than compared to what that community was experiencing. I think as policymakers, what we need to do now is figure out how we can make sure that these EPA standards are implemented as quickly as possible. And as Dr. Peltier and Mr. Brown were explaining, that's going to require some political public pressure, because the law allows them to continue to operate how they've been operating, right? Even though we understand now that the levels of emission in our community are too high, the law still allows them some time to implement the extra standards that they need to do to clean that up. And the other issue that we have here are those fugitive emissions, because we know that there's a lot of warehousing that goes on. Midwest Sterilization is the largest plant in the United States. They use 1.3 million pounds of ethylene oxide in their operations per year. That dwarfs the second highest plant operations, which are actually, it's a Midwest plant located in Missouri that use about half of that. So the level of ethylene oxide use in our community is incredibly high, which means our emissions, even at 99.99%, are going to be too high for what the EPA is now finding out are safe levels. Well, there are no safe levels, but even at 99.99% control of those emissions, they're going to be too unacceptable because the amount of ethylene oxide that they use is so much. So when they talk about the alternatives that can be used, that research, I mean, we need to be pushing the company to use alternatives because of the risk level in our community. There are things that are coming out that will allow us to advocate so that this company can operate safer and this company can use less of this toxic chemical. What we find difficult is that it is a company that owns its building. In Illinois, the company did not own its building, and the public pressure encouraged that owner of the building to not renew their lease, essentially, and he kicked them out. It's a little bit different here because it is a company that does own its building, does own its land. What that means is they have legal rights. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to get them into compliance other than through the law, right? Using our ability to advocate and to make sure EPA starts to make that data that they're asking for, the extra data, publicly available so that we have a better footing when we go and advocate for what we need to keep our community safe. And I think this is the beginning of a discussion, right? Because seeing the risks and understanding what we're facing, we really need to, as policymakers, look at to what we can do, that we're confined by the law, but we do want to make sure that our community is safe. And, you know, we've all on council, we've been unanimous in trying to face this challenge. And we will find with our legal department, we will look for those things that we can do to hold them to that higher standard and decrease the emissions in our community and work towards there being that better policy for how they operate so that those risks can be as minimal as possible. Midwest right now produces 40% of all the surgical kits that end up in surgical operating rooms in the entire country. That fact makes this is not a decision that can happen overnight, because it disrupts what is also a really important service. But at the same time, we can't allow that ironic fact that they are producing kits that save people's lives in one area at a risk to the community here, because we are not a sacrifice zone, right?
I just wanted to add, there's other states that are very much more protective than a state like Texas, that have very much lower standards, and that's not the case here. So we need our local leadership and us to pressure the TCEQ to step up and protect and defend our community here. TCEQ is the state Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. This gentleman has been waiting here, I think.
Buenas noches. Mi pregunta es, yo tengo 12 años viviendo a menos de una milla de la planta contaminadora. Me acaban de detectar el septiembre 9 linfoma. ¿Es recomendable que yo me mueva de ahí? ¿Que me vaya a afectar más adelante?
This gentleman's name is Francisco Ortiz. He's been living less than a mile from the plant. And just recently, this September, he was diagnosed with lymphoma. He has been out of work and is having a difficulty pay his rent. But his question is, does he need to move to alleviate some of for his health?
I probably can't give you a full answer, but I'm so sorry this has happened. The exposures to ethylene oxide occur over our lifetime. It's generally not something that happens instantly. It's an accumulation over many, many years, often at low concentrations that lead to cancers. And so there's no right answer to this question, because we can't be sure that even if you moved somewhere else, that your exposure would go back to zero or that cancer would never return. We live in a world in which we are always trying to reduce our risk as much as possible. We can never get to zero, but we look for opportunities to reduce our risk. And sure, moving further away would probably reduce your risk. But there's a great cost to doing that, a personal cost, an economic cost. It's a big challenge. And so I probably can't give you a full answer to say, if you moved away, you'll be fine, because nobody can make that guarantee.
He's been living there for over 12 years, for about 12 years. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I got you.
Test. So what is the concentration of the ETO? I mean, is there a certain concentration that they're emitting that we know of at the plant? I'm sort of curious of that. I have a million questions, but some from our a few for our city leaders that I've been living in there living in the area or in the vicinity for over 30 years. And this plant's been in existence since 2005. How did that happen without me knowing? You know, did it just show up? I'm sure it was a good business deal, you know, to attract them here. And then knowing that they're so close to the residential areas and other warehouses there, how were they able to get into that area? You know, I know the predominant wind is from the south, like you had mentioned, but I mean, that's something for our city leaders. I don't know, maybe they got a contract and they can't get rid of them, I don't know. But what is the concentration, back to the original question, of the ETO that do we know what it is that they're sterilizing this equipment? I mean, is it 80%, 50%, or is it just 100%?
So you're talking inside the sterilizer chamber itself?
Right. What?
Yeah, so I think it's around 50%.
50%.
50% of the air in that chamber is ethylene oxide. It does vary by the product, I think. I'm not an expert in how sterilization process works, but it's around 50%. Ethylene oxide is very flammable, and so if you filled a chamber full of ethylene oxide, it could be explosive. So it's a danger to do that. So they cut it with nitrogen gas, which is not harmful. The question for the public, though, is what comes out of that facility? What comes out of the loading docks and the windows and the emission stacks that are on the roof? And then where those products go, some warehouse across the street, down the road, to another town, those things continue to off-gas, those materials. And that's where those exposures happen, because that's where our communities are.
Right. So we're getting these samplings at 50%?
I think the amount directly outside of the facility is like the canister that was directly outside the facility was about...
Yeah, so if you look at what we call the fence line, which is right at the edge of the facility in one location, we saw on average about 5 to 6 parts per billion, which is around 5,000 parts per trillion, give or take, something like that. Right. But remember, we're talking about canister samples. That's that one strange-looking device that sits hanging on a pole for a 24-hour period. Sometimes it's downwind, sometimes it's not. Right. So even 5 parts per billion or 6 parts per billion, that's a conservative estimate. Sure. It's probably quite a bit higher.
Right.
I'll add, I work with a lot of communities across the country that are dealing with very similar issues, and a lot of folks are asking, how did this happen? One part that I think is really unfortunate is how long it took EPA itself to get to this point. It wasn't until 2016, as Rick mentioned in his presentation, they started studying this in 1998, and it took them 16 years to complete this study. And it's only recently that a lot of the regulatory motion has happened since 2016. And so I do want, to the extent that it is helpful, and I know for myself, when I'm in trouble, it is helpful to know that there's others with me, that Laredo is not alone in this problem. There are communities, 88 communities across this country that are facing similar issues because of the use of ethylene oxide. And so if that is of any comfort, I know sometimes it is comforting for me to know that there's others that are standing with me.
Hi, just to reiterate on your question about how it happened. So we're not able at the local level, at the city level, to regulate the permit for the permission to use the gas. That's a federal and that's a state allowance that they have. We can't take that away from them. What we can regulate is our land use policies, our zonings. And unfortunately, back then, there wasn't the oversight to require this type of facility to be located maybe in an isolated zone, within so many feet of a residential, or those are things that we at the council level can do now, and we have taken steps in that direction. We've taken steps to try to require warehouses that to classify ethylene oxide as a hazardous material, to follow the hazardous material process, to advise the city, and then maybe implement some restrictions on distance from houses and schools. And those are the things that we can do at the local level. But once a facility opens up, purchases land, gets a permit to operate, it's very difficult to go backwards. That's why it's very important to get it done right. It's very important to have a government that understands those types of issues, to learn from the past and see what you can do to try to mitigate some of the damages, and then implement policies so that it doesn't happen again.
And who does that enforcement?
The
Fire Service or?
Well, we have code enforcement, but it's a permit process. Once you implement the ordinances at the city level, and you say, if you're going to operate a plant with that uses ethylene oxide, you must be in a M2 zone or a special zone. You can't be located within so many feet of a school or a residential area. Sometimes you will get pushback from the landowners, and they'll sue the city or they'll sue a council member because they want to put what they want to put where they want to put it. And those are challenges that we have. You know, it's because Texas is very landowner friendly. So it all does depend on what state you live in, and the state laws, which then kind of, you know, whatever they don't address in the state level, then we are able to address at the local level, and that's something that we're trying to do. Unfortunately, like I said, when we came in, like, we didn't know about this problem. Now that we know about it, we're trying to do everything we can to help the situation.
I think we have time for 1 to 2 more questions. And then we want to let you know that we hope you signed in with your information, because we're going to put a summary of the questions you asked, the next steps y'all want, and what the city leadership can do with the Clean Air Laredo Coalition. So I think we've got time for a couple more questions.
I do have a question. I understood that it is 2 to 5 months that it can be in the air, and a few weeks in the water. So it is good that you are making us aware of the dangerous situation that we are facing. At the same time, I think that we shouldn't be too fearful. I sense that people is getting fearful about what can happen. According to the papers that you handed, you say that the cancer, it is like no 100% from that situation. We know the risk because it is a chemical, and every chemical has a risk. We do face that. But it is like we just need to be conscious about the effects that the chemicals can produce on us. But if it is, the chemical lives a few weeks in water, see, and 2 to 5 months in the air, and the air is always blowing, and here always, the air is always blowing. So, yes, we need to be concerned, yes, we need to be aware, but at the same time that it is like, I think that people don't need to be so fearful about the situation, just to be conscious and to take precautions. And what can we do? And you say there is nothing that we can do. It is only the facility that needs to change the process of the sterilization using either another chemical or the way that they release the gas, because it is a gas.
Thank you for the comment. So regulation of things that potentially threaten us cannot be driven by fear or worry or concern. They have to be driven by data. And as a scientist, we're driven by the numbers that we observe, collect, analyze. And when we have a body of evidence, scientific evidence, good science, that's been replicated by lots of people, only then can we make a conclusion on what we consider to be safe or not safe. And so we look to the EPA, to TCEQ, to other scientists who are doing this kind of research to not give us comfort that what we're doing makes us safe, but to give us certainty that what we're doing makes us safe. And so when we look at the evidence that's available now, that really has developed since 2016, even before then, we became more and more confident that this exposure to ethylene oxide at certain levels leads to cancer. That's not a good thing, but it's something that science tells us is true. And we always have to, as a scientist myself, I always follow that science and reach a conclusion based on the observations that I have in front of me. It's not based on fear or emotion or worry or politics or anything like that. It's just driven by analysis. It's boring, it's technical, it often is not exciting to read, but ultimately we arrive at a conclusion that says the level should be this if we want to keep X number of people safe. And so that's where we come from, a position that's driven by data. We're not really driven by fear. I understand that cancer and ethylene oxide can make us worry. It sure sounds very scary. And you know what? People who have cancer are worried and they do get scared. But regulation, what we do with industries, what we do with regulators who are making measurements, what we do with scientists, have to be driven by the data that's in front of them. And so it's more objective to do that. I'll hold this even lower. It's more objective to do that, and we have to strip these kinds of decisions from the emotional connections that we have with these terrible diseases that are caused by ethylene oxide.
I will add, there's a huge role for communities to play in the regulatory process. I mean, the amount of, EPA noted in the rule that they have not received as many comments as they received on this rule for a NESHAP, which is a hazardous air pollutant regulation. And so there's a lot of space and roles that communities can play in making sure that TCEQ is playing a role in this and making sure that EPA is playing a role in this. Because it's hard to, force a facility to do something when you need a regulator to step in. But there's a huge role that communities can play in getting regulators to step in.
Hi, so I just had a quick question. So going back to kind of cutting through with courts or something, is there anything to do with the evidence, or is there sufficient data you could say that would be enough to be to file for an injunction through the courts or something to kind of, again, going back to more immediately stepping through, given now that we have in 2 years' time that will take effect through the EPA, but that it can be done now, given the severity of it, of the data? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can't really say. I am not barred in Texas, so I don't know, what the law would be in Texas for that. I can say in general, these facilities have a permit to operate. And so there's a presumption that when they have a permit that they can do what is involved in their permit. And their current permit, unfortunately, includes that old rule that we were talking about. Now I will say we represent RISC in an action where we were challenging that permit. Midwest had applied for a permit renewal. RISC had challenged it. If some of you might remember, I think it was last year, Midwest's CEO herself came down to Laredo and had to hear from the community and their thoughts on the fact that they were operating this facility with very little controls. For me, incredibly powerful moment, because I guarantee you she's probably not had to hear from people that have been affected by the actions that they have done. And so the fact that, RISC was able to force her to come down here from Missouri was an incredibly important step. However, in terms of, legal actions, there's, potential tort cases that can be taken against a facility like Midwest. We've seen that in other states. In Illinois, there's been multiple cases. In Georgia, there's one. I believe there's one in New Mexico. But in terms of, their permit itself, in general, when a facility has a permit to operate, they can operate as long as they are following the terms of those permits.
And that permit is through the state of Texas or through the EPA?
It's through the state of Texas.
That doesn't have regulations?
Exactly. I mean, so Texas has to implement the standards that EPA has required. So Texas, unlike other states, so for example, if you lived in California, California has extra requirements that are not required by EPA. So for example, in California, if you lived in LA, they have to get fence line monitoring at that facility because of the fact that the state has an extra requirement that EPA does not. Texas does not. Unfortunately, when it comes to sterilizers, there's actually I've seen EPA has a list of which states have additional facilities. The majority of them don't. A couple of them do. But Texas is required by law to require a facility like Midwest to meet the standards that EPA has set. And so the permitting process occurs through Texas, but Texas is required to make sure that the facility is meeting EPA's regulation.
Thank you.
One more. You've been waiting, and then Councilmember Melissa wanted to have a few things, and then we'll have Michelle give the final thoughts here.
And I'm sorry to interrupt because I think it's pertinent to the question that was just asked. So our health director is, because of the actions of council to create an air quality program for the city of Laredo, he is determining now the outline of a monitoring plan for the plant. So as a city, we're going to, since fence line monitoring is not required here in the state, but as a city, we feel that it's important to make sure that they are meeting the requirements set by EPA. And so that is what we are intending to do to make sure that minimum they are following what they need to follow with fence line monitoring.
Yes, I think you'll have the last question.
Well, I got two. First of all, this is concerning for the care or how this really affects first responders. Anybody has touched upon the subject about what's happening right now in Georgia. Does this chemical react violently if there's a fire that you cannot put it out with water? You have to use some of the stuff, like foam or something. And if so, is Laredo's firefighters prepared to handle a fire like that? Because it will spread to some surrounding houses. And that's one. And then the other one is when they do sterilize instruments. Well, somebody covered already what I was going to ask, surgical, but they didn't say, is it safe to be invasive into a person's body? I mean, is that stuff being put in it? That stays on the surface of objects for how long? And it makes you very scary of, when you're going to go to the surgery. As it is, it's scary enough. Now that you know about this, did they somehow sterilize it from the ETO? I mean, before they use it on people. So nobody has covered that.
Firefighter question, and then number two, your question was, is it safe to have these sterilized products be inserted into your body? And
Before you
on
the fire.
So I'll try with a firefighter. Firefighters deal with fires of all kinds of crazy chemicals. And I think ethylene oxide is probably one of many crazy chemicals that they have to deal with. And so I don't know for sure, but ethylene oxide, the flammability of it is probably no different than methanol, than other petrochemical products that are out there.
But they need to know, sir. I'm not a firefighter, but I'm just concerned, and it's happening. If you look at the national news, it's happening right now in Georgia. They were having trouble putting out a chemical fire at some plant, and it reacts violently, and you cannot put it out.
Yeah, so that's a
And then if Laredo, we're not that big of a stadium, and we may not have all the equipment, do we have the necessary chemicals to put it out?
Sure. So I can't answer the question because it's very specific to firefighting.
So I don't know 100% the answer to your question, but I can tell you that the city of Laredo they don't know because the city of Laredo has a hazardous material policy. So the firefighters do know which materials are stored at which warehouses. So when they respond, they'll know what material they're going to be dealing with when they get there.
But is that material considered hazmat material?
No, Well,
Because
ethylene oxide.
There's a table explaining how to approach it.
Well, that's why we put it on the agenda to have ethylene oxide categorized as a hazardous material and treated as such. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
So,
That's something else that can be used to, like you say, this plant was, like you can say, grandfathered in, and there's by the owner. Okay, fine, but if they renew it, they need to. If that chemical is hard to extinguish the fire, God forbid there's a fire, that could be a point that you need to bring across to them for the safety of not only them but the employees there and also the surrounding community there. You know what I'm saying? And also to better prepare our firefighters, or responders.
On the question, I think, on the question of, I think my colleague Michelle would be able to answer the question on like its safe level when you go to a hospital. I will say there's a separate rule. Unfortunately, a lot of hospitals also use ethylene oxide. Their EPA estimates at one point in time about 1,300 facilities in the country used it. We don't know which facilities use it. There will be a new rule to regulate that as well.
Actually, the question I want to just give a little bit of context to around the firefighting issue and when first responders are having to deal with something like ethylene oxide. There's another branch in the EPA that deals with what's called the risk management plan that actually does account for combustible, flammable, and other kinds of materials that are deemed to be very dangerous, especially for those in surrounding communities, as well as those who would be considered first responders, including folks who are paramedics and of course, firefighters as well. And so that's another issue that Earth Justice has been involved in, trying to make sure that both the unions for folks who are working in the, and having to potentially respond to this issue are both aware. So there are literal plans, that's a part of the actual rule, is to create plans for facilities to actually respond, to also require some look at safer alternatives so that some of these chemicals can be phased out. And then also, as far as the firefighting foam is concerned, that is something that can be used when water is not adequate for putting out a fire. In fact, there are times where water could exacerbate an issue. And so separately, that type of foam is often used by firefighters, and those particular chemicals that are used within the foam, those are other substances that have been very well studied to understand, what are the concerns with those as well? What are the risks that we might have, that we might want to track? And I think that'll kind of segue to something I want to make sure is clear, especially as we've heard from so many of you in the room. We have been taking notes of all of the questions. I think it's amazing and ecstatic to see you all that you're here. You've stayed here for all of this time. And there are others who are not in the room with us who could really benefit from the conversation that was had, and especially the questions that you're asking, because I am not, I'm being very frank and transparent when I say these are the kinds of questions that we all have been asking and trying to figure out where's the data, where's the research, and where is the gap? What do we need to do? What needs to happen next? And so as we're wrapping up in some additional, we have your contact information, but in additional correspondence, we'd like to be able to answer some of that information and provide additional context to the questions. So please do look out for that, because again, these are the kinds of questions that many others in the room and really across the country, to be, again, frank, could really value, or to say benefit to hear and to understand. So I want to thank you all for that and pass it to Ms. Perez.
I just want to add that it's important for you all to understand how important it is to get involved, because there are gaps in knowledge and there are issues like you brought up that need to be addressed. But there is one thing that wasn't said tonight, which is there is a convenience and an economic factor when it comes to the choice to use ethylene oxide, because ethylene oxide produces a byproduct, which is what we all know as antifreeze. So they use the chemical to sterilize, and then they capture some of this. It creates antifreeze, and then they make money off of that as well. I think it's important for us to try to regulate and push that we eliminate that financial factor from it, so that when you remove that as an option for them, then maybe they'll start to look into these alternatives, And convenience is that they wrap these products in a package, and this chemical can get through and will sterilize things that don't really need to be sterilized. So we also think that there may be overusage of the chemical just out of the convenience. And since there's a financial byproduct for them, there's really no reason to limit their usage. So we have to band together and push so that we, force them to realize that their convenience is not a good reason for us to get sick.
Well, thank you all so much, and thank you to the Laredo Public Library and Councilmember Vanessa Perez who secured this. Y'all have been here. Thank you very much. We're gonna send out notes, and please sign up. And thank you to our guests, and thank you to each and every one of you.